Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tawny Samiski. I'm an entomology specialist with UMass Extension's Landscape Nursery and Urban Forestry program, and I'm very excited to introduce to you all the very first webinar in a series of 7 webinars about invasive insects. So these are brought to you by UMass Extension's Landscape Nursery and Urban Forestry program, as well as UMass Extension's Fruit program. This series is freely available to you due to support by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and their Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. So we thank the USDA for that support. I also have on here with me today Jeffrey Jouet, who is helping with the GoToWebinar tech support for today. So Jeffrey, do you mind proceeding to the next slide? So before I introduce our first speaker and our presentation for today's webinar, I do want to give some background information about the process for pesticide and association credits. So it's very important that anyone who is looking for pesticide credit as a result of watching this webinar today or association credits, that you listen to these instructions, and most importantly, that you stay with us throughout the entire duration of today's webinar. So further instructions for receiving pesticide credit for Massachusetts categories 26, 27, 29, 35, 36, and the applicator's license or core license, as well as association credits for Mass Certified Arborists, MCLPs, ISA, and SAF will be shared at the very end of this webinar. Please also remain on the webinar until the end to receive these instructions and to take the quiz for pesticide credit. So the quiz that we are providing after today's broadcast is only required for those of you looking for pesticide credit. However, if you sign off the webinar before taking this quiz, you will not be allowed to retake it and will unfortunately not be awarded the pesticide credit. So again, please stay with us through the entirety of the broadcast. So without further ado, I want to take the time to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Phil Lewis. He is the project leader with the Aphis otis Laboratory, and he will be talking to us about chemical management of the spotted lanternfly. I do want to, before we switch to Dr. Lewis, to remind folks that you have a function in GoToWebinar, a little menu that says questions here on your dashboard. So you can type in questions that I will be able to see, and I will do my best to answer those that I can during the webinar. And then after the webinar is done, Dr. Lewis will stay with us to answer a couple of those questions live, and I will moderate that with him today. So again, please enter your questions using that function. All right, so without further ado, let's switch the screen over to Phil.
All right.
And please take it away.
Great, thank you, Tawny. Appreciate you allowing me to kick off your new series here. And so spotted lanternfly has been a big topic recently, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it. So I'm based on Cape Cod at a forest pest insect laboratory, and what we do here is provide support to USDA APHIS programs, operational programs like Asian longhorn beetle and now spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer. The lab was originally started back in the late 60s for gypsy moth research and control efforts, and so that continues with other forest insect pests. So for today's talk, I want to give a brief overview of background and history and biology of this insect, and also some of my own research work and other work that Penn State and many other researchers are involved in combating this pest. So you can see the insect here. This is the fourth instar, turns red. The previous instars are black and white spots, and you can see on this trunk of the tree many fourth instars crawling all over it, and then the later stage, then the adult after the fourth instar will come out and emerge, and they all feed through a stylet and feeding on plant sap. Okay, so here we go. So before I get into the latest pest, that would be good just to spend a minute or two just reviewing some of the old ones that we're all familiar with. Of course, gypsy moth has been here over 100 years, and I think everyone's well familiar with this insect from Europe. There's another one too, brown-tailed moth. This also came over and was a pest around the same time when gypsy moth was first a pest at the turn of the century, and the last century actually. So brown-tailed moth is right now kind of restricted to just some small populations on Cape Cod, National Seashore, and then also more recently up in Maine. That population has exploded. I'll show a slide in a second. So this is the caterpillar, and the big issue with this insect is the poisonous hairs that the caterpillar has, and some people are very allergic to them. It's kind of like a poison ivy rash. If people come in contact with the hairs, they break off and cause extensive rash, and could even be serious with respiratory symptoms. These are the overwintering cocoons, quite easy to see. Usually they like to have these, they produce these in oak trees and also apples. Very easy to see because they go out onto the tip and create these little cocoon masses with a number of the insects are inside overwintering. So just briefly, near Portland and Casco Bay, you can see that this infestation, which used to be just a minor one, has become a big issue. And you can see the counties listed that there's a high incidence. This is based on surveys looking for the overwintering caterpillars. So another one closer to home is the winter moth, especially on Cape and along coastal areas in Rhode Island and Boston and Connecticut. This insect is from Europe. The females are wingless, and it's closely related to the Bruce spanworm, and I think it took everyone a little while to realize it wasn't the Bruce spanworm. And I have my own personal story from this is I have a silver maple in my backyard that for the last 4 or 5 years it just gets totally stripped, and I don't get any leaves on the trees until say July, just because of this voracious pest that just starts feeding right before even bud break. So you can see the extensive damage that this insect causes. So again, another one from Europe, but we've had our share too of insects that are invading us from Asian countries, and I think people are familiar with the Asian longhorn beetle. We have our very own population up in Worcester, and there's still active populations in Ohio and in New York. And another one that's just starting to impact Massachusetts is the emerald ash borer, and that one's been ongoing since the early 2000s when it was found up near Detroit. So anyway, so just a brief overview of some other insects. This is spotted lanternfly, is just the current pest of the year here for the last several years. So you can see the insect is quite large. It's 1.5 to 2 inches in body length with the wings, the adult stage. And you can see the hind wings are brightly colored. And then later in the season, when the female is producing eggs, you see the abdomen swells up and you get these yellow fat bodies that are visible. So it's quite a colorful and large insect, and we don't have any, it's in the group of fulgurids, and we don't have any that large that are natives. So it was quite distinctive when it appeared. I had mentioned before that the first 3 instars are black and white, and this is what they look like. This is the egg stage, usually covered with a substance to just protect or coat. They're not quite sure what the substance does, but you can see again the 4th instars and the adult. And the reason that it's become such a problem is it's easily spread. For one, the host plant of the spotted lanternfly is Atlantis, which is very common in Pennsylvania where it was first found. And you can see this truck just parked by the side of the road here, maybe taking a break or loading or waiting for a driver, I don't know. But you can see how easy it would be through the trucking industry to pick up a few hitchhikers or maybe even an egg mass or two. The adults like to lay eggs on almost any surface, and then the insect can spread through that way. And tree of heaven is a very weedy species if you're not familiar with it, but it grows very well in harsh conditions where a lot of other trees and shrubs do not. So any disturbed area along roads and things like that it's very common to see in Pennsylvania. And the tree of heaven is actually an Asian species. It's from the Far East, from China and Asia. It was brought here in the late 1700s by hobbyists and people interested in new horticultural specimens. And Philadelphia is one of the key locations where it was introduced, and rich people would have plantings of Atlantis on their properties to kind of show off this unique specimen. And so that's why, especially in Pennsylvania, it's just very common to see along roadsides. And it's not just out in the forest, but this insect has invaded a lot of homeowners. This is, I think, it's not an Atlantis tree, but you can see the huge numbers of adults all over this. I think it's a maple tree in this backyard, homeowner's backyard, and also the eggs that were being laid by the females on the play equipment. So you can imagine if people are moving or transporting their goods to another state, how easy it would be to transport the insect as well. And I'll talk about all this black stuff here in a second that's under the tree. Looking back at the eggs again, you can see it's just very difficult to spot these. I've been out in the field when I first started going out, and it's just very difficult to even, it takes a little bit to notice the egg masses and differentiate that from just bark discoloration or lichens. And you can see when the insects come out, they pop a little hatch open and they spring out and are jumping and walking right away. These are third and fourth instar nymphs. Kind of look like raspberries or something there. But you can see also all this honeydew. So you saw that in the previous picture with that large maple tree. The honeydew that's secreted by these insects is just so abundant that we get this sooty mold that forms on the leaves and on the undergrowth around the trees, and then that blocks photosynthesis, and so you get these bare patches underneath trees and shrubs as these insects are feeding. Another picture of the insects crawling up and down the tree. These are there's a few third instars, but mostly fourths. And then here's a picture of on Atlantis. You can see a couple fourth instars and all these adults that are starting to feed and hang out. It's a close-up of the insect. It's very pretty looking, interesting insect. You can see a couple other slides I have of trees that I've worked on. You can see just the congregation of these insects on the trunk, and they're also way up into the canopy as well. And again, you see these dead areas around the tree where the honeydew just is pouring down from these trees, and it coats any green grass or shrubs that are growing underneath it, and you get dieback. And you can also see this white stuff, and that's actually from so much of the honeydew accumulating that you get this like brewer's yeast forming, and it's just disgusting. And by the way, it smells bad, as you would expect this in this situation. So it's very distinctive, and in these high population trees with these high populations, you can get that white mat forming, fungal bacterial mat. This is the tree I worked on. Again, you can see this dead zone around the tree. And I think normally this groundhog hole would have been covered. Maybe it kept the homeowner from losing the tire on their mower, but anyway, you can see again just the impact and some of that white gooey stuff starting to form under this tree as well. So it's not just a problem on Ailanthus. Here's a couple of agricultural commodities. They got apples and grapes, and the insect doesn't feed on the fruit, but you can see any inch of this vine that's available, they are nosing into that and sucking out the sap, which decreases the sugar content of the grapes as they're maturing. And apples, it's more of a, not so much impacting the fruit at all, but at harvest time, the insects are just all over, and you go on close to that tree and you're harvesting apples, they'll be jumping all over, and so it just becomes an issue where they can't harvest these trees because they would likely transport the insect as well. This is a story, interesting story, where this is a Christmas tree that had some egg masses on it. This is a lady in New Jersey, and she always bought her Christmas tree from Pennsylvania, whatever farm she'd always go to. So that this is several years ago. She got her tree, brought it back to New Jersey, and for some reason she left it up until late January. So you think about this tree is in her house for nice warm 70-degree temperatures for a couple months, and she called New Jersey Department of Agriculture and said, I've got fleas coming out of my tree and they're hopping all over my house. So I think everyone was kind of on alert already about spotted lanternfly, and so they sent a couple of staff members to investigate, and sure enough, they cut the limbs off and they found these egg masses that had been laid on this Christmas tree. And you can see how easy it is to miss these things. This is a couple of freshly laid egg masses. It turns a little darker tan like you see in this picture later in the season, but it's just very easy to miss these. And this is some egg masses that don't have the coating. They're weathered, they're older, could be a year or two old, and you can see where the insects have emerged. I want to play a short video for you. This video was taken back in 2017, and I think it was mid-June or so. So these are nymphs that are on the Ailanthus trees, and you'll see the rain just coming down. So if you're ever in Pennsylvania and you're under a tree and it's sunny out, but it's raining, it's probably spotted lanternfly. So you can see just the abundant amount of honeydew that's being secreted by these insects as they're feeding on the sap of the tree, and the impact that's happening underneath. So this video was actually taken by an arborist with Davey Tree, and he sent it to me. It was a homeowner property that he was managing. And the homeowner was complaining because the landscape under the tree was just coated with honeydew and was wet and slippery. And he treated it, sent me another video a week or so later, and it was all dry and no more lanternflies. So we'll talk about that treatment in a little bit here. But I want to go back to the start of the insect. So the origin of it, and initial specimens were collected near Boyertown, Pennsylvania, which is in Berks County, as you can see here. And that was in the fall in 2014. And a homeowner called and said there was a strange insect on his shrubs and trees, and they identified it right away as being some kind of exotic insect. And so then they pursued that and identified it as the spotted lanternfly. And of course, as I mentioned before, the key host is the tree of heaven. So this was first identified in 2004. So 2 years later, about 2 years later, you can see this is a map, and this area is north and west of Philadelphia. So there was a 5-county area after about 2 years, and it was spreading, but not too bad. And the original spot, they figure, was from a landscape company that had a quarry, and they sold stone products and things, and they had their own stone, but they also imported a lot of stone from China. And it's thought that through the slate and the granite and things that they were importing, that the eggs, which you saw, which you couldn't even really tell were there, were being laid within the stone products and packing and creating materials, and then spread from that. So that's just 2 years. It's within a 5-county area. And a year after that, you can see here again, here's our blue star with the origin point. Now all of a sudden they expanded out to a 13-county area. Here's New Jersey here, and here's the Philly area. It just started to creep into the Philly area. So this is 3 years after the initial introduction, or the initial discovery of the insect. So I wanted to share a little personal story of my own as I was driving to do some of my own research work in 2017. So here's the New York metro area, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so here's the site where I was going to. And as I was driving through 95 through New York and New Jersey, I saw the sign that said, "Visit Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Wine Trail and Tours." So as you can remember, the original graphic I had, and here's Bucks County. So they do a lot of tourism outreach to the New York metro area to try to get tourism for their wine industry. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I was able to get the picture while somebody else took the picture while I was driving. But here again, back to the research site, it's near the core area where I was, and I had to stop by the Walmart, get a few supplies on the way. Welcome to Walmart. And I get out of the truck and some of the lanternfly adults are landing on me and on the truck. And I'm looking around, and there's no trees. The only trees I could see were some honey locusts that were in a few of the islands near where the cars were parked. So I went up to those trees to investigate, and sure enough, there were the lanternflies up and down the trunk and in the canopy of these trees. And they weren't just in the parking lot and landing on people, they were in the Walmart, in the foyer area as people were walking in and out. These things just bumble around and they're just trying to look for a host plant, but they were actually in the store. So you can imagine all these hundreds of people every day at a Walmart and all these other stores in this area, and how easy it is to transport this insect. So I want to show you a second video. This was taken by one of my technicians who works in Pennsylvania. And what I want you to notice is, you can see before I play the video, you can see all the insects lined up and down. You can see this river of sap that's just flowing down the trunk of this tree because of all the honeydew. You'll see insects spraying out honeydew from time to time. And you'll also see some honeybees flying around, taking advantage of the nectar that's being produced. So there you can see the honeydew falling down. All right, so that's pretty scary stuff so far. Some more pictures of the adults. And again, some trees are very attractive to the insect, and you'll see these large congregations of adult lanternflies, especially on Ailanthus, the tree of heaven, and especially the adult stage is very attractive to this insect. So you can see these congregations and then the extensive feeding, and you start getting sap flow from these trees. All right, so let's move from all the scary pictures and how bad it is to what are we doing and what can we do to control this insect. So just a couple of graphics to remind ourselves, this is 2016 when we had just the 5-county area. And then within 2 years, we were into the 13-county area in Pennsylvania. And then in danger of, right on the border with New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland. So as I mentioned before, Tree of Heaven is a key host. So what the approach has been initially through the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, initially did a lot of control activities, was to do a trunk application, a bark spray application of Dinotefuran, which is a systemic insecticide. And it worked very well. We see large amounts of insects being falling out of the trees and forming at the base of the trees. And so what they would do is they would remove on a property or parcel, they would remove most of the ailanthus and leave several of those trees as trap trees and treat those. Since they're so attractive, we would just remove most of the host, have any trees that are remaining as poisonous, and that seemed to work quite well. We saw a lot of success with that. However, the current status of the insect is, you can see, first of all, this is the original 13-county area. Earlier this year, they expanded it to include another 12 or so counties. Some of these counties just have certain areas or townships that are infested, but certainly it's a much bigger area than we've been dealing with before. You can see also these 8 counties in New Jersey, a couple counties in Delaware, Maryland, and actually way out here near Pittsburgh, we have 2 counties that are infested, so right on the border with Ohio. These we think are associated with rail activity, with railroads, transportation industry. This infestation here in Virginia is interesting. This was identified as a result of the original find in Berks County, was at that stone import-export business. Sorry about that. I guess somebody's actually working on our building today. Anyway, so they did a trace forward. So they identified companies and businesses that did work with the stone company in Pennsylvania. And this is one of the ones that was identified. So they started doing survey in and around this landscape company that sold stone products. And sure enough, they found lanternflies. So that's an active infestation that they're trying to eradicate as well. Another map that's produced by New York State Integrated Pest Management Program shows those same areas. And actually this is updated, so we have 2 counties in Virginia now, and actually a county in West Virginia. There's an active population identified there. But what this map also shows is finds with these red dots on these counties. Those are transitory incidences where there's adults or life stages of lanternfly that have been found, but no established populations that we know of yet. And actually we have one way down in North Carolina as well. So it's a pretty scary picture of how fast and easy this insect can move. And there's plenty of the host material around, as I think many of you know. So going back to control, when we started treating in 2016, 2017, we saw right away, even with the nymphal stage, which is very hard to see in the leaf litter, but I circled in red here where the nymphs were identified. So we knew right away with the spark spray treatment of Dinotefuran that we had something that was being effective. And then of course, as the insects matured and grew, then we saw these large piles and insects. And also we saw this wing flaring, which is when the insect is being poisoned by the chemical, and they'll lose their muscle control and will flare their wings. Again, more pictures of dead insects. So it's actually quite easy to kill the insect. It's just that there are so many of them and they migrate and move around so well. So just a little bit more on this chemical application. The operational procedure is that we'll go out and start treating our trap trees in May or June. and we're just doing a single application from the base up to about 5 feet in height, putting out a maximum labeled rate of Dinotefuran, and that's sold in, by trade names either Safari or Transtect. And this application method and chemical is also and is being used to control emerald ash borer. Dinotefuran is what we call a systemic insecticide, which means it's water soluble. The plants actually take it up and move it around just like they would a nutrient or sugars or anything else that they're moving. So that's what makes it so ideal, is that it gets way up in the canopy and is available to impact the insect. This is the chemical structure of Dinotefuran. It's a sister compound to imidacloprid or merit, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with that as well. So this is the packaging for the Transtect product. It's a 70% product. The other trade name is Safari, and that's a 20% product. And this Transtect is rather expensive. It's this expensive chemical. It's that pouch there, that black pouch will cost you about $350. And the application method I've already discussed, but from the base to about 4.5 to 5 feet. We're using the high rate that's on the label. It's 12 packets per gallon. And based on how much you can treat of a gallon, the cost using that rate is about $3 per diameter inch of tree, which is quite expensive considering many other products are just going to be pennies per gallon that will cost you for the product. I want to look back at some of the behavior and biology of this insect. So I was on this one property and the homeowner had cut down his ailanthus, was trying to get rid of it. Well, when we were out there, all these adults were trying to find ailanthus any way they could. So they're all surrounding the stump and some other old roots that were still poking out of the ground. Any place they could get ailanthus, they were going for it. And in fact, on another part of the property, there were some sprouts of ailanthus coming out on his lawn, and sure enough, there's about 10 insects that were nosed in there trying to get some of that ailanthus sap. So we're not sure if they need it for some of their toxins that they have in their body or defense mechanism or something like that, but they definitely are highly attracted to ailanthus. As far as the host list, this insect feeds on over 70 plants: grapes, apples, maple, birch, sycamore, willow, sumac, rose plants, and obviously many others. Preferred hosts, again, is tree of heaven, black walnut and butternut, hops, oriental bittersweet, sawtooth oak, tulip tree, and chinaberry. This is a graph that's published by Penn State Extension showing when the insects are active and on which plants. So you can see insects start to emerge in May, depending again on how warm it's been. I think the insects are just starting to hatch out in Pennsylvania right now, so they're just starting their season. This year it's been a little cool in May. But you can see come August or so, you start getting the first adults that emerge. And they are active all the way through October until a hard frost. So I want to briefly go over a study that I designed and conducted in 2017 and 2018, and want to look at different treatment options and different chemicals and when the best time to treat would be. And so I set up a series of tests where we compared the bark spray applications using the Dinotefuran, and then also a trunk injection method of application using 3 different formulations that were available: the Dinotefuran in a liquid formulation, imidacloprid, and also emamectin benzoate, which some of you are familiar with from its use with emerald ash borer. So this is the equipment that we used for the trunk injection. It's ArborJet's quick jet air product, nice Massachusetts company. And the insect feeds just within this phloem layer right behind the bark, and that's where these trunk injection applications, you drill a small hole, and under pressure you're injecting the insecticide into the sap of the tree. Whereas this bark spray, the tree actually absorbs the systemic chemical from the bark, and I'll show you some pictures of how long that takes in a bit. So this is a setup. We had a number of trees on a property, and we would tarp out, treat the trees, and then tarp them out to about the drip line or so and catch the insects that were being impacted. And this is the property, the primary property I worked on. You can see, depending on the lean of the tree and where the canopy was, we would adjust the tarps to that area. So we saw activity almost right away. If you can believe it, this is a 4-hour count, and we're already seeing and hearing the insects just fall out of the tree onto the bark, onto the tarps. And a little zoom in of that picture, and you can see the wing flaring again. And there's a few leaves on there, but these are almost all spotted lanternfly. So after a few days, then we have hundreds, and sometimes even I would get thousands of insects after a few days on some of these tarps. So it ended up taking quite a bit of effort to clean and reset these tarps every few days. But you can see the setup, the general setup here. So results, this is from 2017. First thing I want you to notice is that the emamectin benzoate product is here on the bottom. It was basically zero. It didn't work at all. The insects were not being impacted by it at all, which is interesting, but they're not. The bark spray, so this is a traditional application that's been used and is being used, is in this red line here. So that performed well, and about similar to the trunk injected imidacloprid. But what stood out is that we had these much higher peaks through the Dinotefuran trunk injected product. And you can see our average numbers here, where we're sampling every 2 or 3 days. So usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday, depending on vacations and holidays and things like that. But we did this for 6 weeks, and you can see this drop off here. And that's related to the biology of the insect. The insects, when they first come out as adults, they're feeding heavily, they're looking for the Atlantis, they're bulking up, and then they begin to mate, and they actually migrate then. And that showed up in the data here, is that we saw them just leaving the area and moving out. But huge numbers. I think it was over 30,000 insects on the tarps that I had set up over that 6-week period. We repeated that again in the following year, and just because of the statistics and having problems with replication between the treatments, we tried to increase how many trees that we had of each. We dropped the ones that weren't working and increased the other ones that seemed to work well. And so we had a setup of bark sprays, and then the trunk injected of the Dinotefuran and the cloprid. And this is what we saw in 2018. You can look right away at the scale. We had, actually for this year, we had, for that 6-week period, we had over 250,000 insects that we counted on the tarps over that period of time. And there were some days early on where we had 6,000 or 7,000 insects under one tree after 2 days, and we cleaned the tarp off, there'd be another 5,000. So it's very impressive, but it's very hard on your statistics, and so it's hard to compare and show that there's a better product. But in general, the trend is that the Dinotefuran trunk injected product is superior, consistently superior over time. And again, you see in late September, you see that migration, and you see that decline in the number of adults that we're capturing. So that's just another part of the biology of this insect, is that we are killing these insects off every day, and more of them are coming in from the surrounding areas. So it's a very difficult insect to control. So just to wrap up that study, conclusion-wise, the adults are very susceptible to Dinotefuran and imidacloprid. I saw that the Dinotefuran, when applied as a trunk injection formulation, was actually superior to the other treatments. I did a few trees that were combined with the imidacloprid and Dinotefuran as a bark spray, and that did not increase the mortality. Emamectin benzoate was not effective against the insect. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, individual trees are highly variable in how they are attracted to the lanternfly. There were certain trees that were very attractive, and that threw off statistics as well as along with the numbers of insects that were coming in. But clearly there's some factor that the insects either they're visually attracted to infested trees with other insects on them, or there's something that retains the insect to those certain trees. So the people are looking into that. It would be nice to know which trees are super attractive so that we could target those and use those as our trap trees. Briefly, just want to talk about longevity of the chemical. So we put the bark spray out in late May, early June, and this is a study we did early on to look at the decline over time, because what we want to have is season-long control. So we're not just targeting the adults or the nymphs early on, but also the adults when they come out. And so we retain pretty good levels of insecticide through even late September, and by October, most of the leaves are gone at that point, but we did see a decline. I did a little bit of more of a robust study the following year where we treated 3 different times during the year, either early June, early July, early August, and then we tracked those sets of trees. We had 10 trees in each group, and looked at how much chemical was present over time. And so what we saw is that we saw a little bit of a decline by October in residue values, but we still saw that there was, even for early June applications, there was still significant amounts of insecticide left for that. So that was a good sign. Another interesting thing was comparing amount of residue. This is the bark spray treatment, Dinotefuran. This is the amount of the imidacloprid, which is higher in the trunk, but performs similarly. When we look at how much chemical is actually in the trees of trunk injected Dinotefuran trees, you could see it's 10 to 15 times more, 100 parts per million versus around 10 to 12 parts per million for the bark spray. And that declines over time, but there's still so much chemical in those trees. So that method really, we get high levels of product in those trees. We did see that, like I mentioned, that drops over time, but there's still so much chemical in there. And like I mentioned, the bark spray levels are consistent over time, and I think what's happening there is you're spraying the bark and it's absorbed and protected in the bark, and then the tree just over time is slowly absorbing more and more of the chemical. So you see a nice steady levels with that. Okay, I want to, last few minutes here, I want to show a little bit more of what other people are doing. This is Penn State Extension, has a number of excellent publications for homeowners and also ag industry. So this is a table within their homeowner guide, and just looking at different products as far as looking at residual activity, and then also activity against adults, and well, nymphs as well, nymphs and adults. So looking at some soft products like neem, insecticide soaps, botanical oils, even spinosad, you get control, but it's not very good. But there's a lot of different chemicals that can be used. Bifenthrin is a key one, and that has excellent longevity. Also the ag industry, again, this picture of the grapes that I showed before, and they've done a lot of work looking at various compounds that are available to growers, grape growers, and you can see there's really excellent activity within this top group of compounds here, from malathion, carbaryl, some of the older insecticides, to Dinotefuran, dimethoxam. Some that don't work as well or don't last as long, so you kind of have to look at that too. So I just wanted to briefly go over an effort that's being done within my laboratory. So I do the chemical side of things, but there's another group at my laboratory that is looking at biological control for the spotted lanternfly. So it's a big collaborative effort overseas and here in the U.S. as well, looking for looking for agents, insects that can impact spotted lanternfly where it came from in China and Asia. So there are a couple of that were identified early on. One is parasitic wasps, and Anastatus is the genus. And this other insect is Dryanus. It's an external parasitoid, produces external sac as it's developing. So very distinctive parasitoids. And so the approach for biological control is that before we would introduce any of these insects, we want to make sure it's not going to impact the non-targets, which are our native fulgorids and other plant hoppers and leaf hoppers. So 5 were selected. We also tested other insects and egg masses from gypsy moths, wash bugs, leaf-footed bugs, mantids. So there's a whole range of and battery of tests that have to be looked at to make sure that we're not, if we do introduce these insects, that it's not going to negatively impact something that we're trying to preserve or do not want to be impacted. So this is a setup. This is one of the fulgorids, one of the larger ones that's native, and you can see the egg masses are fairly similar to the spotted lanternfly. Some are quite different. You can see here. So what we saw, unfortunately, is that with the Anastatus parasitoid, that we did get emergence of males and a female. They were quite a bit smaller, but they were able to complete their life cycle on this Publicia egg mass, the native. So they're still doing some work, but it doesn't look too promising for that insect. So anyway, they'll continue that work, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
All right, thank you so much, Phil. I do have questions here, and I was working on answering some that were coming in. I'll give you the first one I have here from Kyle. Do the trapped trees sustain enough damage to result in mortality of the tree, or is treatment with systemics successful and preserving infested trees?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just because of the numbers of insects that are coming in, even with the insecticide, you're still injuring the tree. But I have not seen trees that have been treated. I have not seen mortality. I've seen on that one property where I did that study, the TARP study for 2 years. There were some large stems, like 20-inch stems near where you saw that landscape, and those trees are all dead. So ones that were not protected are succumbing eventually. It takes a number of years, but they are being impacted. But yes, we can protect those trees with the insecticide treatments.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Adam. When is spotted lanternfly active on Oriental bittersweet? We have a ton of it here in New York City parks.
Good question. I think I have that slide. Let me just get out of the presentation, and then I'll be able to scroll back a little faster. Oh. You know, I'm not sure, but I think if you could contact Penn State Extension, the person who could answer that question for you would be Heather Leach. She's one of the authors on this publication. So if you type in Penn State Extension lanternfly, you'll see the homeowner guide, and then the online version will have Heather's contact information.
Great, thank you. Another question from Kathleen. Can you tell me about the use of Dinotefuran? Does it harm the tree? Does it harm the bees that are attracted to the dripping honeydew?
Dinotefuran doesn't have any negative effects on the tree. It's an insecticide, so it doesn't have any herbicidal qualities or have any negative impacts. You know, when we do the trunk injection, we are drilling a small hole at the base of the tree, so the tree will have to respond to that wound that's been introduced to it. But when you put it out as a bark spray, there's no impact on the tree whatsoever. As far as impact on pollinators, that is a concern, especially during flowering, that the insecticide could be transported to the nectar and pollen. So the label actually has restrictions against treating when the tree is in flower. Usually you don't see the pollinators coming in until the fall, just like you do around your picnic table and dumpsters, when other pollen sources are not available, the wasps and bees will come find it wherever they can. So usually late in the year, like by September, is when you see the pollinators coming around, and there can be some insecticidal effects. I've seen some pollinators that have been exposed to the insecticide or under the tree, but I wouldn't say that there's anything like a large kill or any huge amounts of pollinators that were killed.
Thank you, Phil. Let's see. Another question from Marlene. If adult spotted lanternflies leave, do they return to the same trees the next season?
That's an excellent question. So that was something that I looked at in that TARP study from 2017 and 2018 when I realized this was that the trees that were super attractive the first year were also the ones that were very attractive the second year. So we're actively looking at that, trying to identify if there's some component or something, or if it's just the lanternfly is just zeroing in on themselves. Like maybe they see other lanternflies, so they go there. But over time, it somehow it happens over time, and from year to year. So how does that happen from generation to generation? You know, the insects lay their eggs almost anywhere, but the adults aren't really, not the adults. The nymphs are not necessarily on Atlantis. They're kind of on all different kind of things. But come the adult stage, they will congregate and almost feed exclusively on the tree of heaven. So that's an interesting question that people are puzzled over and are trying to pursue.
Thank you. Another question here from Ronald. Trunk injections and bark sprays will need to be repeated annually, or he's asking, will trunk injections and bark sprays need to be repeated annually? Is there any evidence that the populations near the original finding are thinning out? So maybe two questions.
Yeah, so as far as thinning out, the core area has kind of, you know, it had a big surge initially, and then there were reports in 2018 that it wasn't as bad in the core area, but all these other areas were popping up again. So it's quite variable year to year. So you don't necessarily have continuously bad infestations, but it can be. So it's not consistent, and people aren't quite sure why the insect just didn't stay where it was. I think just maybe some of the migration behavior of that insect. As far as year-to-year carryover, that's a good question too, and I've looked at that. Dinotefuran is not a very stable compound. It's broken down fairly easily in the environment through just biological processes, sun and other processes. And there is some carryover year to year, even if it's trunk injection or bark spray. I do see some chemical residue the following year, the year following treatment, but at levels that are like half or less than if we had treated it that year. So yes, you do need to treat every year.
All right, thank you. Another question here, let's see, from Rhoda. With such high levels remaining in the leaves in October, is there concern that these leaves could harm non-target detritivores when the leaves fall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can get you a publication looking at that because that question came up with emerald ash borer and when we're treating ash trees with these systemic compounds. And anyway, I can get that to Tawny and she can make it available possibly extension publication from Michigan State. But basically, what happens is that the insecticides, these systemics, are tightly bound to organic matter, so they aren't. If the leaves fall and start decomposing, they're not immediately releasing these insecticides. So through the slow biodecomposition process, the insecticide just gets slowly broken down. It's not like a big release or anything like that. So it stays bound to organic matter and it pretty much stays on site.
Great, thank you. I sent Rhoda my email address so she can email me for that publication. Another question here, I think we've got some time for a couple more. Let's see, who is next? From Diane, states are treating in May. Is that too early?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say early May is probably not ideal. And really based on how easily the chemical breaks down over time, you want to save and have the most amount of chemical you can come September, August and September. So if you can wait until late May, that would be best. I did some studies where we looked at really early treatments just because of there was a push for treating even earlier just because of the huge, which you can see from the maps, the huge areas that have to be treated. And so when we treat in April, you really see a steep decline by the time August and September comes around. So really not a good idea to treat in April, and I would recommend treating as late in May as possible.
Thank you. Probably only time for one more question here, and it's so hard because there are so many good ones. I'll just go with the next one. Do you know what percentage of other insect species were found on the tarps after treatment?
Other species of insects? There's
Yes.
not a lot of natives on Atlantis, so it was interesting that sometimes you'd see a tree cricket or something like that, but it was 99+% spotted lanternfly.
All right, thank you. Quick answer. So maybe let's see, do I have time for one more question here? In heavily forested areas are vast tracts of trees being defoliated?
I think it takes time for the insect to really impact trees, especially if it's a large tree, which has a lot of resources with the roots and everything. You do see a lot of blackening of stems with the honeydew and this black city mold that starts to grow. But you don't really see defoliation. You'll see dieback. You won't see defoliation with this insect.
All right, well, thank you so much, Phil. This has been great. We really appreciate you sharing this information with us. And if anyone's questions did not get answered, I just shared, at risk to myself, my email address to everyone in the questions or in the chat area. So please email me those and I can either answer them or send them along to Dr. Lewis. So with that, please stay on the webinar while we swap over to show